Next, we'll discuss speech communities and speech fellowship as to what speech community is, what a speech community is, and how is it different from a speech fellowship. A speech community is a group of people who share the same variety of language. And by sharing the same variety of language, we mean that they have similar kinds of attitudes towards that language. They use the same kind of vocabulary, same grammatical rules, etc., for the use of the language, and also use that language for the same social functions or any kinds of functions. Um, if we look at the word speech, it is a form of social identity. For example, the way you speak in a way determines your social identity in terms of your age group, your socioeconomic class, your attitudes, your political or religious leanings, and all that. So, speech is a symbol of identity for any human being. It is used as an indication of membership of different social groups and speech communities. So, if your speech is your identity, it will also determine the larger group of people you would like to associate yourself with. Or by default, if you use a certain kind of speech, you become a member of a certain speech community. But this situation is not as simple as it seems, um, especially with respect to English and other languages also. So, not all people who speak the same language are members of the same speech community. Let me give you an example. We in South Asia, let's only take the example of India and Pakistan. Many people in India and Pakistan also speak English and very good English. And this English is either similar to or is a form of British English or American English. So, are we saying that the Pakistanis or Indians who speak English are a part of the same speech community as the Americans or British people? Obviously, no. We are not members of the same speech communities. So, what is it that makes a speech community, and what is it that distinguishes between different speech communities, or makes a distinction between people who speak the same language, but we still have reservations in calling them members of the same speech community? Similarly, we have American English, we have British English, we have New Zealand English, Australian English, and these are all considered standard Englishes. So, people who speak this language are considered people of the same speech community, although there are differences in these different varieties of English. They have different codifications, they have their own dictionaries. We even have something like a dictionary of Australian English, etc. So, are all these people members of the same speech community? At a more restricted level, all the people in America, all the Americans speak American English, but then there are very clear differences in different dialects used in different parts of America. For example, the dialect which is used in New Mexico or Georgia or Carolina, these dialects are very different from each other. So, do the people who speak different dialects of American English are people of the same speech community or different speech communities? So, at a wider level, maybe we can group them as members of the same speech community. So, a speech community is a broader, a wider term compared to speech fellowship, and different varieties of a language. For example, English can be subsumed into a speech community, whereas speech fellowship is a narrower term. It refers to these sub-varieties that we use. So, people of, let's say, Pakistan and India, they probably speak a sub-variety of English, a Pakistani variety of English, so they can be called to have this speech fellowship. Similarly, in America, people use different dialects of American English. They can claim to have a speech fellowship amongst themselves. So, according to Kachru, speech fellowship points out or indicates the real world of English users. The real world of English users, for example, we do not have one English in the world anymore. So nobody speaks the same English all around the world. So, speech fellowship helps us in understanding or defining the real world of English users, which means there are people who use several sub-varieties of English or local varieties of English. So, this speech fellowship, the idea of speech fellowship, justifies the underlying distinct differences and characteristics that these sub-varieties have. So, this distinction suggests that speech community is a broader term and speech fellowship is narrow and close and compared to speech community. This distinction and dichotomy of native English speaker, EFL speaker, ESL speaker, etc., is not considered a very useful kind of distinction or dichotomy. If, for example, we keep focusing on the distinctions and dichotomies, we probably will not be able to find solution to lots of issues which are linked with this spread of English and the concept of world Englishes. So a more desirable and useful way of looking at the situation is grouping together different varieties under the concept of Englishes and looking at the functional characteristics instead of the distinctions of forms, grammar, dialect, vocabulary, lexicon, etc. The varieties which have these distinctions can be grouped together on the basis of the functional characteristics that different varieties have, or the functions for which they use these varieties of English.